I'm Greg Remke. I work with economic thinking. We do workshops on the economics of high school and homeschool speech and debate topics. And one of the Stoa resolutions being considered resolved that a comprehensive program of penal reform should be adopted throughout the United States. I've dealt with a number of criminal justice topics and prison reform topics, and this is interesting. The wording, one of the issues, for example, with prison reform is that if it's a U.S. federal government prison reform, that doesn't reach most of the U.S. prisoners who are in state prisons. So a reform that would reach out to state prison systems as well as the federal has advantages in various ways. Anyway, what I want to do here give sort of an overview of what I would see as the economics of this topic and what I would develop if this were chosen to do workshops for students. So I hope this will be helpful. Again, we've had a number of related topics in the past, one on federal court reform. So here's reducing pretrial detention. Turns out tons of people get thrown in jail for days, weeks, months, even though they're not convicted of a crime. They're in detention ahead of the crime. They can't afford bail, or for some reason they're chosen to stay in school, so they lose their jobs. All sorts of terrible things happen. So this is a link to a conservative article, Mark Levin, writing about why, from a conservative free market standpoint, you would want to reduce pretrial detention. So another past post is on overregulation, and this has to do with how the federal government in various and state governments in various collateral damage to the drug war are seizing private property without a trial. They can, they could accuse you of a crime, but then you get a trial. But if they accuse your truck of a crime, they can arrest your truck and take it. Or if they find you with $20,000, they could accuse it of a crime, right? Maybe you're going to buy drugs. So they accuse it of a crime and they seize it. So this whole area is, it sounds bizarre, but that's something in the status quo that people have been trying to reform, but it keeps staying on because it's such a huge source of income for state and federal criminal justice systems. So the resolution Stoa has proposed that a comprehensive penal reform should be adopted, and they talk about various aspects of it on their Spring Vote 2020 page. So you could go, the Charles Koch Institute has a number of articles. They're making a big push on criminal justice reform, prison reform, and you can find out more there. I'll link, I think, to a video that gives you sort of an overview of this. Also, lots of issues. Maybe there should be justice for victims. How could the court system change itself around to focus on victim justice rather than sort of just general criminal justice? There's notes on the negative. I think this is linking to a Heather McDonald article who's very critical of a lot of the prison reform or criminal justice reform efforts. Probably the strongest thing that I find appealing, particularly with the Christian homeschool audience, is the push for restorative justice. And this is, you often hear, gosh, should we have retribution where we're punishing criminals as a way to reduce future crime or because they deserve it for committing a crime? Or should we have rehabilitation where we're trying to teach criminals, help them get a college degree or help them become better people? The alternative is restorative justice. That's victim-focused justice, that when people commit a crime, they become indebted to the victims of their crime, and they should restore the victims back to where they were before the crime as much as possible. It's a long historical tradition, biblical tradition, common law tradition. And so restorative justice, looks at reforming the system with the focus on restoration, which also involves some punishment because people have to pay back the money for the damage they caused. And it also turns out to be the most effective rehabilitation system ever, because when people earn their way back into society, that restores them, that rehabilitates them in a major way. So that's part of what some of those articles are about. And then there's, this is the Heather McDonald quote that's critical of a lot of the reform efforts. One of the resources I'd recommend is Right on Crime, and this is sort of conservatives calling for criminal justice reform, because you had a lot of conservatives saying, look, let's get tough on crime, let's throw these people in jail and throw away the key, but Right on Crime is saying, look, there's way too many people imprisoned. We had a perfect storm of people on the left saying, let's throw people in jail for environmental crimes. You had people on the right who were on the drug war, throwing people in jail for, smoking marijuana. So those sorts of reforms would decrease criminalization. We've got more people in prisons, than anyone else in the world, including China, even though we're less population. So what could you do? Well, you could reduce or reform pretrial detention, which I mentioned a minute ago. You could have jury trials. I mean, the Constitution, you've got a right to a trial by jury, and yet 90% of people don't have a jury trial. In theory, they have a right, but because of plea bargaining, they're being threatened by prosecutors. So you can have a jury trial, but if you do, we're going to charge you with 5 times as heavy a crime as we will if you just plead guilty. So this bargaining process basically means most people don't get a chance for a jury trial. If they take that chance, it's a huge risk, and they can go to jail for a long, long time if they happen to be convicted. Ending mandatory minimum sentences. This was part of the Get Tough on Crime effort, and what it means is some people are put in prisons for long times for things that no one thinks is a good idea, but it's written in the legislation rather than being in a decision that judges and juries make. Reform prisons. Prisons are a mess for lots of reasons. With the coronavirus, you've got people stuffed together. You've got huge outbreaks in prisons because of that, and you've got a huge expensive system. Reformers say one of the big problems is people can't work. These are people who are stuck. They need job skills for when they get out, but the prison system is set up so they don't have a chance to work, to earn money, to pay back their victims, to cover their expenses, to develop job skills. And it's problematic in a number of ways. And then a separate sort of issue is there's way too many crimes, things that are considered crimes. The one of the books is called 3 Felonies a Day. Basically, on average, people commit 3 felonies every day just because there's so much overregulation. So this is a really sort of wide range of things that go from trials, the criminal justice system, managing prisons, all in this broader area of penal reform. The heading I have here was from a previous debate topic that looked at federal court reform and criminal justice reform. And so all these things can be reformed on the state level as well as federal, whereas past topics, the resolution limited it to the federal government. So here we are, the Sixth Amendment. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused has the right to a speedy trial in public by an impartial jury in the state or district. And in fact, that's not a right that people actually enjoy. It's a theoretical right, but in fact, most people don't have access to that. We don't have jury trials. Why not? Well, they're considered they'd slow up the system. They're too expensive. Well, that's because we've got too many crimes. And so they're marching huge numbers of people through the court system on things that weren't crimes before that now are crimes, and they lack jury trials. So less than 5% have that option. You have plea bargains. You have to plead guilty to a lesser crime, even if you're not guilty. Even if you believe you're not guilty, you're said, look, you better plead guilty because otherwise, the state can throw the book at you. They're going to charge you with a much higher crime. So it saves time and money, that's true, but it gives prosecutors huge amount of power to pressure guilty pleas out of people. They want to have a 97% conviction rate. So many problems in the status quo that, there's no bad intentions here. It's just developed over time, and it's not what anyone would have wanted, but it's sort of what we're stuck with, and that's a reason for reform. Here's an article we had on jury trials. I chose this picture with Harrison Ford just because it's appealing, but he's in one of these promotions, and here we have the link to the article on our economic thinking page. If you do a search for prison reform, jury trials, you'll find that information. Why do innocent people plead guilty? Well, because if they don't, they could go to jail for a long, long time. So more on the case against plea bargaining. This is Timothy Lynch with a more in-depth paper on this as part of Regulation Magazine. So Right on Crime has a whole bunch of things. Heritage Foundation has a Overcriminalization task force and project to try and reduce criminalization. We have too many things that are crimes. There's lots of things that are wrong, lots of things people shouldn't do, but that doesn't mean they should be crimes. And when you criminalize everything, you make a mess of the system. Yeah, selling flowers without a permit, that's a crime. A separate area of approaching this topic is judicial engagement. And so you have an ongoing debate between conservatives claiming liberals or leftists or progressives have judicial activism, where the judges are making up law by, going in and trying to do justice in ways that aren't found in constitutional documents or in the legislation, and that's judicial activism, and people are against it. Well, then you have the people who say, look, let's defer to the legislature. Let the legislature, they make the law. If these laws don't do what they want, then let them reform the law. A third approach, which is what the Institute for Justice, a conservative or free market group or libertarian group proposes, is judicial engagement. And this is for judges to not willy-nilly be activist and write whatever they want, but to engage to protect the rights of everyday people, and to not just say, well, we'll let the legislature sort it out later, to actually take a step to enforce the Constitution and push back against legislation that seems to be clearly unconstitutional. The next link in bottom right is to a website, Braiding Freedom, and this looks at an issue of should people have rights to, let's say, to give a haircut? If you get training as a barber, should you be able to cut people's hair? Or what if you just, watch a YouTube video and figure you know how to cut hair? Can you charge someone $10 to cut their hair? Absolutely not. Hair cutting, hairstyling, even braiding, African American style braiding, is illegal unless you have a state license. There's a huge number of everyday economic tasks that are illegal without state permits. This makes it hard for low-income people, for people that don't have connections, people that can't afford to get all these permits in the name of public safety. But the argument is this isn't constitutionally grounded. People have a right to freedom of association, a right to earn a living, and what economists argue is people in professions lobby to protect themselves from competition. So in Florida, to be an interior decorator, you've got to have a license from the state to be an interior decorator. So you can't give advice on decorating a house and earn money for it without a permit. So there's a whole range of things, everyday economic activities that are out of reach because of these regulations. Now, this comes up in the current pandemic because nurses, doctors can't leave state borders. There's all sorts of restrictions, and they're trying to relax some of that.
Why would I need a license for something that I've been doing all of my life?
So I'm going to switch through that. You can watch that online. So David Mayer in this book by the Cato Institute, I believe, Liberty of Contract, people should have a right to contract. The government can't just stop contracts unless you have a permit. This ties in with the penal reform thing, because lots of things people try to do are declared illegal because the state doesn't give a permit for it. This is overruled, similar theme that who should control the Supreme Court? Should the Supreme Court protect freedom of contract, the various economic liberties in the Constitution, or should it defer to the legislature to decide what's possible? For example, now you can get arrested for, going outside. In Michigan, if you drive from one of your houses to another, that's illegal. They're arresting people at parks or outside who are violating curfews and stay-at-home laws. Well, does the federal government have these rights to take that power? And, what role should the Supreme Court play in this? This is Kilo, City of New London. This has to do with eminent domain. Can government come in and take your property if it says there's a public use, and what defines public use? So the battle over eminent domain, is it within this penal reform topic, or is it a property rights federal court topic? I leave that to your debate advisors. I'm drawing from overheads that I prepared earlier for the federal court topic. Here's more on the Supreme Court, some handouts we've got. This is overcriminalization. If you walk down the sidewalk, find a feather, pick it up, take it home, that's a felony. If that comes from a bald eagle, it's a felony, even though bald eagles are plentiful, and it's, they're not endangered species. They used to be, and the feathers are. So there's a whole bunch of things that are, illegal because of overcriminalization. The law is complicated. How would people know whether something is legal or not? This is from Federalist 62 that said, look, if the law is so complicated, so confusing, so many thousands of pages, like a federal regulations, that everyday people can't read it and can't understand it without a law degree, are those laws just? Should you be convicted of a crime that you didn't know exist? And people say, well, ignorance of the law is no excuse. What about ignorance of 50,000 pages of regulation that are complicated even for lawyers to figure out? Well, because so many things are illegal, this is why homeschoolers often say if a policeman comes to your door, don't let them in. Because if they come in, they can look around, maybe they'll find something that's illegal. So again, this sounds sort of paranoid, but these are standard, this is James Madison's standard sort of issues with overly complicated laws and regulations. So a change in the a penal system would be that if a common sense, if a man on the street wouldn't see it as a crime, it's not a crime. And there's a legal term for that is in the articles. So this is an article about restorative justice that I mentioned earlier, and a link to that. The organization, and again, retribution, crime reduction, rehabilitation, what's the purpose of these laws? What are we trying to do? And restitution says you want to make the victim well again. There's a story here, and the article explains where that comes from. The organization, many organizations work on restorative justice. A lot work on this in high school and schools and so forth. But the broader view is it's now called the Center for Justice and Reconciliation. It's part of Prison Fellowship, the Chuck Colson Christian organization, but trying to find a different way to manage the criminal justice system.